Hey everybody, and welcome to the Noetic podcast. I'm your host, Jordan Klein, and I'm joined by my lovely co-host,
CJ Eller.
And welcome to our third installment on Montaigne's essays. And CJ's going to be our discussion leader, so I'm just going to hand the mic on over to him.
Sure, so the essay we're exploring is Our Feelings Continue Beyond This Life. And it is a discussion of death and how we treat the dead, and then how we treat the dead, how we view death, and how we view, again, what happens when we die.
Right.
So I found this very fascinating, and at first I wasn't sure if it was going to be applicable to our daily lives, but in some sense it is, because with social media and with the internet, we deal with death in a different way. With each new media, it almost seems as if we maybe view death differently, or we have a different frame for which we can put the death of somebody. But maybe through reading Montaigne, we can discover that perhaps these new frames are actually encapsulating old ways of looking at death.
Yeah.
Which is odd and
hypothesis.
Somewhat uncanny at the same time. So I'm not really sure what we're going to find out, but like any Montaigne essay, it's going to be a bit of an exploration. And
yeah, absolutely. That's an interesting hypothesis, and let's see if we can test it.
yeah, let's tease it out. So let's start, like any essay, with the beginning.
Good place to start.
And Montaigne's going to frame it in a way of looking towards the future. He starts with this idea that we are scared of the future, that we often fear for it, right? And that the remedy is to live within the present.
Right, and that's what we discussed in our prior series of Marcus Aurelius, that in fixating on the future, it sort of robs us of the present.
And he gives a lot of different quotes, or a lot of quips from other scholars and philosophers. He quotes Seneca by saying, "The mind is unhappy that is anxious about the future." And he concludes that the general thing that we have to look at is rest content with the good things of the present, as having no hold on what is to come, less indeed that we have on what is past. So this idea that we can't be too concerned about the future or the past, and just be concerned with the present.
Yeah, and it was I was under the impression that he was saying, all right, look, we have a loose enough grip on this sort of elusive present, so we, sure as Hades, have absolutely no control what happens, in the past or in the future. Yes. So why stress out about it?
But we keep stressing about it, Jordan. And that's the conclusion that Montaigne arrives at. And this is a constant theme that we're going to see in the essays, is that as human beings, we are frail beings.
Yeah.
To not be redundant, but we are frail beings. And that, as Montaigne says, we are never at home with, but always beyond ourselves. And this segues into discussion of, okay, if we're always being beyond ourselves, then we're even thinking past our own existence, that when we die, how will, not even so much where will I go, but what will my body do?
Right, yeah.
Where will my body go? How will it be treated? How will other people treat it?
Yeah.
How will people treat my own death? So thinking about the future, always being beyond ourselves, is a way for Montaigne to say, okay, so let's explore how we view death.
Yeah, and not even just death, but time, and what's our own relationship with time. We can never outrun it, even in death.
Sure, and in outrunning, the first thing he talks about are laws. Being once someone that was a part of the political system in France. He talks about the idea of, or the law that he suits best for a practice when a prince dies, or when a high court official or anybody of those dies, that, as he says, will be investigated after their death. and he'll quote farther, and I think this is what you're talking about, outrunning, that a prince or some high official can't outrun his own reputation. And he'll quote by saying, "It is right that justice, which had no control over their lives, the lives of the princes, should have control over the reputation and the estates of their successors." So in the sense that even if at their time they had a high power, if
they could just flout the law, flog people,
sure, that
seize land,
and even beyond that, when they die, they still don't have that power. If we look beyond themselves, beyond their own rule at that moment, when they die, they are not able to still do that.
Right.
And that goes into this idea of, okay, so then how do we view those, like when they die, or like before they die? We have to, in some sense, bear their injustices. Yeah, which is very odd way to put it, but he says, okay, we have to. I think he says suffer. We have to take everything that they're doing, and we have to suffer patiently, right? But, and I'll quote him, "When our relations are ended, there is no reason why, in the name of justice and our freedom, we should not express our true feelings." And that seems to be a very old way of looking at it, because even today, with our social media and with how we exchange information so quickly, there's a sense where we don't even wait for people to die to really give our true feelings, in some sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of depends, because in this example that we have Nero, right? The two soldiers that defy him openly to his face. So I think that it happened then.
Yeah.
But maybe those examples were snuffed out, and we wouldn't have known about it back then.
Right, and presupposed with that Nero example is this idea for Montaigne that the evidence for Nero in support of his terrible rule were not circulated amongst everybody. Only until after his death was it all circulated. But now we live in a place where everything is circulated. It seems like, maybe not everything, but most things are circulated so that we can gather a reputation about somebody.
Right.
So it's a very odd situation we live in now.
I would say, even to some extent, sort of what comes to mind for me is the relationship of how time can be binding but freeing at the same time for us. And it seems like that was the case in Montaigne's lifetime, but maybe that idea sort of amplified for us today.
Amplified in what sense?
Well, in terms that we're all sort of constrained to time in terms of our bodily existence, or we might have to wait for the iPhone 7 to come out. We're limited in some ways due to time, but then we're also sort of liberated by it.
When we die, right?
Yeah. Because
we always, Montaigne says it. Further on in this essay. After he talks about the idea of, or the law of a prince or any high official being investigated after someone's after their death, is this idea that whilst we live, we always anticipate and convey ourselves through what is, what will be, what has happened. But when we die, there's no connection to that at all. Like you said, we're liberated. Yeah,
and that even could apply to, I don't know, I was thinking like social media, like with our arguably ridiculous campaign cycle, we get these sort of up to the minute updates, and that sort of that rapidity, that I guess sense of everything being released sort of in real time frees us to make those sort of decisions.
Right, it frees us to make the decisions of
who to vote for the election.
Yeah. So then we get to a point though where we think, okay, well, when we die, we won't have any connection with that our Twitter feed will stop. in some regards. Or I think, as he quotes Solon, who I think is a philosopher, he says that a man is never happy, since he is not so until after he is no more. But then there's always this caveat: we still give some sort of presence or some sort of power to the dead. And Montaigne goes on to give the example of Greek law. So we're moving from French law, or time of his time, to Greek law, where he said that if a soldier or if a army wanted to inter the dead of the opposing force, that in that case the loser would be the living and the winner would be the dead, because in some sense they are the people that want to give a proper burial for the fallen enemy are in some sense playing to their game, or are forfeiting any kind of control.
Yeah, and in ancient thought, the powers of the dead were just a very real and present thing. So, I mean, if you look at pretty much any ancient city, they had like the necropolis, which were like the cities of the dead. Yeah. Usually outside of the cities. And there would be, ritualistic festivals to sort of placate these spirits of the dead, to keep these like spheres and these boundaries very separate. So I think in a way that sort of this like power dynamic between the dead and the living, it's it's definitely a fascinating one, and it's maybe an assertion, if they buried their the enemy's dead, that's a power of the dead having over sort of a weaker living.
Yeah, and that they would win because of it.
Yeah, they would ultimately win that contest. Right.
And then there's another interesting example where having that the dead person continues and should be given consideration for what they've done in the past. And he'll give examples later, but one he gives is of some higher Italian commander or general, and he dies, and they're carrying his body through enemy territory, and some decide, well, we're just going to find a way to sneak by the enemy forces. But then another part of the army says, no, we got to attack, or we have to take the offensive and go through guns blazing. And Montaigne quotes one of the soldiers, or one of the higher ranking officials who decided on the latter, and said in response, and tying into what we're saying about the dead having some sort of power, he says, "It was not fit that the man who has never in his life was afraid of his enemies should appear to fear them when dead." So in that sense, that if he went the sneaky route, he would be a coward. This corpse would be like looking at me like, you coward, what are you doing? And he's just laying there like, he's just still dead.
Yeah. What? Yeah, I think a lot of that has to do with memory too.
Go on.
Oh, I mean, I don't know. It's kind of like that idea that you kind of, and like that's obviously the powerlessness when you're dead, because you hope that someone would continue your memory.
Yes. There's an
So it's like that. Yeah. So there's a lot of continuity of the self sort of bound up in memory.
And Montaigne calls that an active power attributed to the remains. And he gives further examples about that too. He talks about how Indians, at least I'm assuming he's talking about South American Indians, because he's talking about how they would carry their fallen chief's bones with them into battle against the Spaniards, and how some other tribes would drag the bodies of the dead soldiers who proved valiant in battle and showed a more enormous amount of bravery with them, because they thought it gave some sort of luck, because they had this courage, and that their courage was still being shown, or was still encapsulated. Again, as Montaigne says, there is an active power attributed to the remains. But then there's also this odd idea that the reputation of past actions is actually reserved from the grave. That they're not supposed to carry, or they are supposed to carry that on, but in the same time, it's not an active power, but it's just, well, if I did this, almost like the first example we gave, well, if I was courageous during battle, then when I'm dead, I should also be courageous. So one example I think he gives is of a French captain, Captain Bayard, who, at the end of his life, I mean, he was shot, and he's kind of getting taken care of. But he says that he was taken to a tree to expire,
yeah.
but he wanted to face the enemy because, and I'll quote him. He says, not beginning at the end of his life to turn his back on the enemy. He didn't want that. He didn't want his back turned against the enemy. He still wanted to be courageous even before he died.
Right.
Right? So there was this thing where it's like he didn't just want to expire wherever. He wanted to expire while he was still being courageous. And maybe that's what he means by saying the reputation of past actions is reserved from the grave. I'm still trying to unpack that idea. That maybe he didn't want to die in a way that would show cowardice.
Well, I mean, I think it's one of those things that, I don't know, I mean, I think I guess if you think about it, with a eulogy delivered at a funeral service, you don't write your own eulogy. Mm-hmm. That's kind of one of those things that it's much more powerful to have a eulogy from someone that because it's someone else acknowledging that you were a good person, not yourself.
So then Captain Bayard saying, like, I'm going to face the enemy would keep his reputation intact.
Yeah, because others would most likely report, oh, wow, like he was, like, bleeding out, and there he was, like, propped up against a tree waiting for the enemy.
Oh, okay.
So in surrendering, sort of doing that act of will, in a weird way, is sort of surrendering some sort of power, but the power of having others keeping you alive in their memory and sort of told down sort of like through the ages in a sort of oral tradition.
And I mean,
is the ultimate service to yourself.
And if we're talking about France, we gotta talk about Song of Roland, right? Which, how many times are there deaths in that story?
Everybody does.
Where it is the most grotesque and yet courageous way to die. Where men have thousands of arrows in their bodies and yet they are still fighting. That this reputation is still held on to them. Not like, oh, they died a coward, they were running away and they got shot in the back. It was...
Yeah, and I definitely think that speaks to Montaigne's time, and that sort of willfulness or that sort of obstinacy, like that we discussed in a few essays back, I think is sort of characteristic of the time. Mm-hmm.
But there is even examples... It's
admirable, but it can also be very destructive.
Or I'm not even talking about destructive, but there's even modesty. As much as we're talking about courage, there's also this sense of modesty as well, because he gives the example of Emperor Maximilian, who would not let anybody see him when he was naked or otherwise. He was this really bombastic emperor, and yet he was modest about his own appearance and his body. That, when he died, he made it so that that his body was completely hidden by drawers. And this is where Montaigne, kind of
a little bit
gives a little joke, and he says, well, he ought to have added by codicil that the man who put the drawers on, should be blindfolded. Just like, oh, Montaigne, you little kidder. Where the sense where it's like, he goes to that extreme of, nobody shall see my body, even when I'm dead. That, well, why, okay. Why don't we just do it blindfolded then? That, like you said, it can, I mean, I don't know if I would say destructive, but it can almost get ridiculous.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Montaigne definitely is pointing to the absurdity of such a request.
Right, but at the same time, this request could also be of a religious air too, because he talks about Cyrus. I don't know if it was Emperor Cyrus or some Cyrus of antiquity who would command that nobody...
The Persian
Emperor?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. He would command that nobody would mess with his body after the soul left it.
Right.
So in a sense that it was based on religious thought. And we deal with that. Or that I don't think that's a thought that is foreign to us either.
Mm-mm.
So then he goes on, and if we want to even get back to absurdity of, and I think this is what he's alluding to, is that this control of how you die can get to a point of such extreme that Montaigne talks about, it's almost a friend of a friend here, or a fellow kinsman who wasted his last hours of his death, and I'll quote Montaigne, arranging with anxious care the pomp and ceremony of his interment. It seems to me almost the equivalent of how you would get an event ready and you would post social media blitzes about it, and he would say, hey, I'm gonna be dying, or like, my funeral's coming up, you should come, and he's just asking everybody, you should come, you should come, you should come, you should come, and sending out invites and everything, and then as soon as he gets everything wrapped up in a bow, he's like, that's good, and then he dies. And Montaigne finds this ridiculous, and he's like, well, what's the opposite of that? It's just like, I just need a single servant and a lantern, and that's it.
And a hole in the ground.
And that's it. So...
Right, but so it also... Yes, it's like one of those things that it's a social convention, right? That you don't plan your own funeral in such an elaborate manner. Like, that's typically frowned down upon. Like, in the Satyricon, Trimalchio, this freedman, gives out all of these sort of elaborate instructions at a dinner party. And people are just, like, sitting there thinking to themselves, like, what is this guy doing? Who does
instructions
that?
Of how he wants to be buried.
Yeah, so it's funny that in thinking about it in sort of a posthumous terms, when you aggrandize yourself in death while you're still alive, it's absurd. It's absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah, I think he makes some of that too by saying, and I'll quote him, he's like, is it after all moderation and frugality to avoid an expense and gratification that we shall neither know nor feel? Like, are we gonna know that, like, yes, my funeral is of a grand occasion, everybody showed up,
yeah, like
my casket is of a gold gilded
yeah,
exterior, and that I look the part. My face is covered with the nicest of herbs and spices, so that it gives off a pleasant aroma. Nobody's like, no. It goes back to what he said before about this idea, where it's like, you kind of erase yourself from the feed, like, where it's like all this anticipation, comings and goings, looking back. When you're dead, it just seems like it's gone. So then he kind of gives his own sort of idea of what his proper burial would be, and he says, like, and I'll quote him. He says, in my own case, I shall simply leave it to the custom to arrange the ceremony and rely on the discretion of the persons, whoever they may be, to whom I shall become a burden. So there is a little bit of control, but it's almost, and he'll quote Socrates, by saying, like, do what you will, right? Where it's like, I can only do so much, and like, I'm just a burden on you anyway. But then again, that elaborate preparation of the funeral might, in some sense, be a way to make people, ease the burden. But there is that bit of thought that it is quixotic in its grandeur of, let me prepare my death while I am still alive.
Yeah, and I mean, to that point of the story about his relative, I mean, it kind of makes sense with that the Senecan quote, or more specifically, the sort of quote about Plato, sort of like knowing yourself and sort of knowing your business, and Montaigne gives his relative flack for not being fully engaged with the process of his own death.
Yes.
So he's not living the present. So I think that Montaigne is kind of alluding to the fact, hey, like, let's just do our business, go about our lives, get to know ourselves, and then we're just gonna die and we'll have friends take care of it. Don't stress out.
So the funeral or getting ready for the burial is not related to actually fully acknowledging and thinking through your own death, I suppose you're saying. You're when you talk about the funeral, it's more so pomp and circumstance, but to learn how to die is another, like the present, like you said, the present thing of like, I'm going to die, or I am dying, is another
Yeah, it's just
thing.
like you're busying yourself until you stop breathing, instead of, I mean, I don't know, I'm sure in my final hours, if I'm left alone by myself, I might think, oh my god, I'm dying, you know?
Sure, and then maybe that is the most important thing that one has to do. And Montaigne discusses that further when he again, we get this sort of stoic sense, or he wants to push for the resolve to see through the arrangement of his own interment. That, I mean, in a sense that he's like, okay, I want to see through that. Okay, I'm going, like, through talking about how I'm going to die or how I want my body to be buried. Not in the grand way, but in a very small way. Like, I am admitting that my death is coming, and that if I can do that in a way that is frugal and just to what it is that I'm about to encounter, then that's the right way to do it. And
and I mean, because then it frees you up in sort of your final moments just to, I don't know, kind of be like Socrates, like, hang out with your friends before you go. And think about your own life and impending death.
Yeah, I mean, I'll quote Montaigne by saying, happy are they who can rejoice and gratify their senses by insensibility and live in their death.
Yeah, exactly.
So then that would imply that this arrangement or this over stimulation of thinking about your own funeral and getting everything in line and inviting everybody, as that one kinsman did, that would in some sense be going against living in your own death. You're not living in your own death.
You're not being present in your own death.
Because you're
already thinking about the fine details of the floral arrangements.
Okay. So you're going
you're
going beyond ourselves.
I'm thinking caterer, I'm thinking floral arrangements, I'm thinking venue. You know, if I'm thinking those details, I'm not thinking about the sort of impending doom in front of me.
Right. Though what's very fascinating, what Montaigne has gathered with all these examples that we've laid out, and that he's laid out, is that we do that for other people. We look beyond their own life, and we give their bodies power, or they give their own bodies power. That in some way we can't escape this always looking forward thing, right?
Yeah, it's like that onus that we carry in our own lifetime, we sort of impart that on others.
Right. Again, it seems that maybe each podcast we give and each essay we explore just is another wrinkle into the frailty of the human condition, but there's this thing where we always live beyond ourselves. So in that, even if we live beyond ourselves, we also think that we die beyond ourselves, right? That beyond ourselves there is something more, and I'm not even talking about a world beyond, but that there is, even on our corpse lives beyond itself, that there is some power instilled in it, or that we have to make sure that there is something that comes before our dead body that makes it seem that our dead body is not taken in vain, right? Or thinking
it's
of
worth
the courage, worth exalting
after you die.
So it seems that Montaigne in all of this is putting his finger on the pulse of our constant looking forward, right?
Yeah, and just how we, I don't know, relate ourselves to time.
Yeah, and that we can't stop, can we? Even if we say live in the present, we still have to say, well, how will my funeral be? Who will look after my body? How will my body be presented? if I die and I'm doing something good, there's this great example of that he gives that I didn't talk about, like of the Scottish king Robert, who was successful in battle against a certain enemy, and he said, so then we have this example like, okay, I'm successful in battle against this one enemy, and if I die, what can I do to help my fellow countrymen and my fellow generals and fellow kings as they go off into battle?
Right.
Oh, I know.
Yeah,
I will.
You want to be useful.
I will be useful by having my bones be carried along for good luck. Because obviously I had that power. I had that fortune and courage and character to fight and conquer. So maybe I can give that to a future generation. So there's still this looking forward,
right,
that we can't avoid.
Yeah, like there's like that use or that hope that you'll somehow be useful.
even when you're dead.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting because it's Montaigne embraces a lot of Stoic ideas, but he also pushes back against them at the same time with that sort of skepticism, saying, well, ideally, of course, we would love to say live in the present, but there's to some degree we're going to think about
the future.
Yeah,
and embedded
potentially
in
a legacy and what's going
and
to happen, that remains.
And that embedded in these practices of how we treat our dead and how we think about our own death and what happens to our body and what our body conveys, there is still this looking forward that we can't avoid, and that in some way we have to grow accustomed to and live with. So that's the end of our podcast. I'm going to be arranging my funeral shortly after this, so I hope that you all will enjoy this. And this is sort of our own little gift to the world for future posterity, that our spirits will continue to live on through the internet. I will let you all go download the Noetic app. You can find it on Google Play. You can find it on the App Store. You can also check us out on SoundCloud or check the Tube of You, YouTube. I am CJ Eller, and I'm joined by Jordan Klein, and I really appreciate this discussion. And we're going to go arrange our funerals. See y'all later.